With Russia continuing to lose tanks, we look at yet another Russian tank storage base. This time the 22nd, one of my favorites. And just like with other bases, I decided to make a complete detailed 3D model of the base, with every single last tank and BMP. With it, we can get a much better idea and look at the base, beyond what's just possible in satellite imagery. The base was actually the very first site the US chose to conduct an inspection under the CFE Treaty, or Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. And there's a really detailed story of it in the book On-Site Inspections under the CFE Treaty. But that treaty put limits on the number of military equipment in Europe by both NATO and the Warsaw Pact, such as tanks. And under that treaty, each side was allowed physical access to the other sites to inspect them for compliance. However, things got complicated. The treaty was signed in 1990, and it went into effect in 1992. If you know your history, you'll know that, in the meantime, the Soviet Union, and with it the Warsaw Pact, ceased to exist. But to stay on topic, the US sent an inspection team to this 22nd Central Tank Storage Base in By, Russia, in July 1992. And the amount of planning that went into the inspection is pretty interesting. They were given detailed briefings on the site obviously, including maps, satellite imagery, reports on numbers of vehicles, intelligence reports, briefings on climate and weather forecasts, knowing every detail of the treaty in the event of a disagreement, code words and encrypted communication plans, security, how to act in local customs and culture. They even had additional safety briefings due to the horrible condition of a lot of the equipment and facilities. It must have been extremely strange being there. The treaty was created to reduce tensions and risks during the Cold War, but by the time of the first inspection, the Cold War was over. Here, Russia was opening up, and many believed a new era of friendship and partnership between the West and Russia was beginning. The US team even brought gifts and other mementos to be exchanged and celebrate together when the job was finished. Yet, at the same time, these inspectors were there counting tanks and other equipment built to fight them. And there were still high levels of mistrust between government officials on each side. When the US team arrived at the base, the Russian officials stated that there were considerably more tanks and vehicles at the site than that they had declared in 1991. In 91, they said that there were 0 tanks and just 31 armored combat vehicles. Yet now, they suddenly are telling the inspection team that there's nearly 1,000 tanks and over 300 ACVs. A full explanation for this was never made clear. However, it's likely that the chaos of the Soviet Union dissolving and the economic and political challenges present at the time are to blame instead of any purposeful intent to deceive and violate the treaty. Then, the US team began inspection and counting. And it's really funny to read the challenges they faced and the lessons they learned, because in a way, it's the same thing that HIMARS, Jompy, and myself have figured out while counting. For example, counting and comparing numbers after each section of the base instead of waiting till the end. That way, if there's any discrepancy, you don't have to start all over from the beginning. Also, whether or not to count a tank hull without a turret, especially if there's a bunch of turrets elsewhere at the base. And finally, the margin of error. During this inspection at the 22nd, the US and Russian countings were off by 2 tanks and 1 ACV, which they just accepted as being close enough. And we do the same. We count and compare numbers, and as long as they're within a couple, we consider it close enough. But if there's a larger discrepancy, then we'll try to figure out why. And now, for our own inspection of the site. Unfortunately though, only from satellite imagery. It'd be incredible to see these sites in real life after all the countless hours we've been staring at them in just satellite imagery. And again, big thanks to Jompy and HIMARS for help here. But the latest, as of September, there's just 102 tanks remaining. We went back and recounted 1 image for each year, 2021 for a pre-war number, 2022, 2023, and now 2024. And here are those numbers. Just a huge drop, from 764 to just 102, which is about only 13% remaining. At the rail station just to the east, you can see about a dozen tanks being loaded onto rail cars to be shipped out, so it continues to decline. For the longest time, this section in the southern part of the base remained unchanged with 338 T-80Bs in use. But then in 2023, they started to pull a few, and now you can see they picked through most of them and there's just 78 left. And there's always the possibility that there are tanks inside the many garages, but in this case, it seems highly unlikely. Some other bases, you can see entire groups disappear, and it's possible that they were just moved inside, but here you see a constant, steady decline. And again, the fact that they started removing older and worse conditioned tanks would imply the exact opposite. There might have been tanks inside the garages in the past that they've used, and we just couldn't see them, but that they're all gone by 2023, so they've started grabbing those worse ones here. But, as we can see, the entire main long-term storage section of the base is now entirely empty, save for these 4 vehicles here. We believe these are BMP-3s. One might be a tank, but it's hard to tell because the BMP-3 is larger than previous BMPs and closer to tank size. And speaking of BMPs and other armored fighting vehicles, here are those numbers. Unlike other central tank storage bases, which consist mainly of just tanks and BMPs, this one has a lot of other types as well. But those total numbers from 1,350 pre-war to just 601 now means less than 45% remain. But a huge caveat here though is roughly half of those vehicles are in these sections here. And we are lucky enough to have some real up-close images of the vehicles that are here. And just look at them. Normally we might write these off, and Russia would too. But some of them have moved around a bit, a few others have been removed over the last 4 years, so we added them, but in our worst category. So a more practical number of armored fighting vehicles is down to probably around 300 or less instead of 600. And really the only decent vehicles are the 202 BMPs here. It'll be interesting to see what Russia does with this base, being that, for all intents and purposes, it's virtually empty. The base is already shrinking. You can see here the entire eastern part is emptied, and they've even built a fence and a wall sectioning it off, so they don't seem to be planning on using it anytime soon. And again, the entire main central section is completely empty, save for those 4 vehicles. And it's even starting to fall into disrepair. It's possible they might just abandon the whole base. It wouldn't be the first time they've done this. A huge storage base in Marikovsky that once had thousands of vehicles was emptied and abandoned by 2012. Also, one base in St. Petersburg that was one of the original Soviet armored tank storage depots and once held dozens of garages, way more than the 22nd, it was also abandoned, and it's now almost unrecognizable. You never even know it was once an armored storage base. It was destroyed due to the Soviet Union collapse and no longer needed. Marikovsky was abandoned as Russia scrapped numerous unneeded vehicles. And now today, after losing so many tanks in Ukraine, Russia no longer needs as many storage bases. So it's possible the 22nd might see the same fate.